to a lot of circles or winding lines. We want to know what are those lines made of. But when you think it through, the only way anybody can ever tell you about them is to describe still smaller patterns within them. Nobody can really think of a way of talking about stuff, because if it has no pattern and is just sort of homogeneous all the way through and has really no shape in itself, I can't imagine a way of talking about it. But you can number and describe and make out, delineate patterns. And so the world takes on, from this point of view, what I would best call a musical quality. Music having the peculiarity of being a language, a form of art in which the principal delight is pattern, and the whole meaning is in the pattern. Music, you see, really doesn't mean anything at all. It's a great art, but one can have absolutely magnificent music which represents nothing and describes nothing. One enjoys it simply for itself, in the same way as you might enjoy fireworks, or watching ripples on water, or watching the shapes of clouds. They don't mean anything, and yet they're orderly. And so one becomes peculiarly aware of this world as play. I have described an experience in the Joyous Cosmology, which was actually based on an experiment with the Mexican mushrooms, with psilocybin, in which I was listening to some Hindu music at the time, in which the players were doing nothing but vocalizing the rhythm of drums. And they have a way of doing it with the syllables dit-dee-dit-da, you know, dit-dee-dit-da, da-dit-dee-da, so on. And they get up to a tremendous speed saying this, and it was the most gorgeous babble. And then they were playing these various instruments, and all the sounds became, I became peculiarly aware of the nonsense in them. There was, for example, an oboe sound, which sounds like somebody singing with his nose pinched. You know, this sort of sound. Children love to do that. It makes a fascinating noise. Why is it fascinating? Heaven only knows. But in this sort of blah, 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 blah sort of sound, which they weave together with incredible skill. They have, Hindu music involves the most complex orders of pattern, and to count it out is quite difficult. But they do it with consummate skill, especially with drums. And as a result of listening to this, everything became that. Everything became Hindu music. And so people, you see, when we listen to our own music, well, that's very serious, and we take it all for granted. It's a violin, and this is a piano, and these seem to be very normal noises. And we've so long been accustomed to them that we take them for granted, and we think that they're perfectly sensible. Whereas, of course, if you listen to it with new ears, they're nothing of the kind. I mean, take an organ, for example. What a monstrous construction of pipes. And playing all these sounds through them, blowing through holes, simply fascinating. But when you hear the Hindus, who do things musically that at first sight strike us as ridiculous, because they concentrate on using sounds that we avoid. But we do sometimes use those sounds when we are, well, especially as children, are trying to see what funny noises we can make. And so they will do things with their voices that sound to us like some sort of clowning. But to them, of course, this is all perfectly normal and serious music. Unless, of course, they are turned on when they're listening, as they very often are in India. And it's perfectly legitimate there. The thing that they forbid is alcohol. It's difficult to get in India. And but they don't forbid bhang. I remember I was having dinner in Kyoto with a Buddhist priest and a little party. And naturally, all Japanese, including Buddhist priests, are drinkers. And he passed round beer and sake in fairly plentiful quantities. He was sitting at the table, a Hindu man, very intelligent fellow, and I noticed he refused them. So a little later I said to him, do you not drink for religious reasons? He said, oh no, it is not that. It is just that I don't need it, and I don't want to cumber myself with just something I don't need. I said, do you drink bhang? Oh yes, he said, you would like it, it's a very good drink. And as you know, bhang is an infusion of cannabis indica. So I suppose the Hindus hear their own music from that point of view very frequently.
What is
Cannabis is hemp.
Yeah.
Vulgarly known as pot. But the impression, you see, of this music at the time, and in the state of mind I was in becoming the music and becoming this sort of marvelous nonsense, everything became that. And so I could see life behaving as patterns do so often behave. Look at a tree. You see, first of all, the heavy outline of the trunk. Then the trunk gives birth to branches, and the branches give birth to twigs, and the twigs give birth to leaves, and the leaves give birth to hairs and veins. And if you go on looking with a microscope, there is wiggle after wiggle after wiggle after wiggle, all coming out and yet all adding up to the perfection of this tree's pattern, like some sort of symphony. And so I could see all the wiggles and patterns of human imagination and behavior as being involved in this, and the things that we call good as well as the things that we call bad, the things that we call healthy as well as the things that we call sick, the enlightened and illuminated and liberated point of view as well as the egocentric and point of view in bondage, all of them as being integral parts of this terrific playfulness which the Hindus call the Leela, or sport of creation. Or better, play better than sport. Play in the sense of playing the piano, playing the drama, and so on. Not play in the sense of the trivial. So it was a most astounding feeling of being entirely a pattern. And nobody was making the pattern. There wasn't a patterner outside the pattern. The pattern itself was it. It grew itself. It created itself. It was spontaneous. It was all there was. And what a wasness. And so one is constantly reminded of this by all natural forms and objects in which pattern is very apparent and in which at the same time transparency is apparent. These two aesthetic qualities go together to be suggestive of the psychedelic experience. And so it seems more than ever natural to surround oneself with not only the objects of human art, but with dried flowers and herbs and grasses and seashells and various kinds of rocks and crystals. And I know a very great sculptor, and no, she's not a sculptor, she's really a mosaic artist and painter. Her name is Louisa Jenkins. And she is a great admirer of Teilhard de Chardin, the very progressive Jesuit theologian. She is a Catholic. And she has caught this feeling of universal pattern from him, and her studio is an absolute wonder museum. And she sees the artistic significance of everything. For example, we were having dinner with her one evening, and she was serving Japanese sake in those small cups. Her cups were white. And one of them dropped off the table and split in two. And we were about to pick it up and throw it away. She said, "Oh, don't throw that away." She said, "I have a use for it." And a little later she presented me, it's hanging in the dining room there, with an amazing face made on a flat disc of cement. And the sake cups had been turned upside down and used as the eyelids for this creature. Well, the thing is that her whole studio contains... Yes, she's painted this. This is Leviathan, the monster of the deep. Her whole studio contains things like skeleton leaves, feathers of the most intricate type, fish skeletons, animals' bones, marvelous pieces of driftwood, gorgeous blocks of quartz, everything that is absolutely fascinating. A child would go out of its head in that studio. But somehow this intimates a world which is entirely design, pattern. And it has an extraordinary levity and joyousness to it. It seems to be a world that is immaterial, in the double sense of the fact that it is not material and that it doesn't matter. In the sense, game theory is very fundamental to it. Now, when Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were at Harvard, both of them started out in their work as very, very respectable scientists in psychology. They knew all about statistics, and Timothy Leary, while he had been here at Berkeley, had done some very careful statistical analysis of psychological mechanisms and so on, and had got his doctorate and was a very respected scientist. Then they began working with psilocybin. Well, they made what was to their colleagues the fatal mistake, not just of experimenting on subjects and making careful notes and analysis of how they reacted, but they took it themselves. And then they slowly began to realize that what is called serious scientific inquiry is a kind of game. And you can see it as that, of course, without being under the influence of a psychedelic. Just by reading some of the literature, especially of the social sciences, where you will find amazing jargons are used, and that you have to be able to speak that jargon in order to belong to the academic fraternity. If you don't talk that way, and if you don't acquire the special rituals of the fraternity, you are not one of the boys. And an enormous amount of these investigations are truly trivial. I remember for a time I was associated with a certain university which has a famous Department of Education. It's in this state. And I remember reading the subjects of master's dissertations when their degrees were awarded at commencement. And what they had done, you see, was to choose subjects about running schools which were as specialized as you could get. I mean, somebody got his master's thesis from writing about the relationship of windows in a classroom to the circulation of air for the children. Now, this is fundamentally a job for a constructor or architect or someone. I mean, you know, but this qualifies one for a master's degree in education. It's simply fantastic. But all those sciences, and this is particularly true of the study of English, they want to become scientific. And that means studying something minutely. Well, it's very important sometimes for a physicist or a chemist to study something extremely minutely. But what these other people are doing, because that the physicist and the chemist have acquired a certain power and status through their studies, they are simply trying to copy the method of doing things in spheres where this method is not particularly applicable. And so it becomes strictly a game, especially in psychology, where anything that is studied has more variables in it than anyone can think about. And so, but it does make a very, very pretentious thesis to put forward some really good psychological statistics. So, I shall have more to say about psychological statistics in a few minutes. But so it becomes a game of staying in a certain caste. Well, they saw through this, you see. And they felt at once that it was really rather ridiculous that they were doing this game in the psychology department at Harvard University and all this, and they ought to be mumbling in their beards and looking very grave. And, so the funny thing was the university couldn't stand it. And it was a question as to whether they were resigned or actually fired. It was probably both. But they just couldn't go on with it. But now then, it followed from that they had to react to the opposite extreme and play another game altogether, which was, of course, what game is there that is the opposite of the academic game is obviously the beatnik game, which is another game too, because that too has its uniform, its rituals, its language, and everything. And the moment you start talking that way, you align yourself with a certain in-group. I mean, if you dig things instead of appreciating them, and so on, that puts you in a certain thing. Because they have their in-group language just as the academic people do. They're all games. Well, now, the problem becomes this. There is a danger when you see how gamey life is to overtly to regard everybody as playing games. So that when somebody says something to you which is supposed to be either serious or sincere, the two things are not the same, you treat it as a gambit. And a person who is by no means ready to admit that he's playing games is very, very put off with this. Because you say, you don't take me seriously, you're treating me as just as if I were playing games. And so too, when people get swept away by the notion that everybody is playing games, they're also liable to get what has been called the holy man syndrome, which is, I am divine, and therefore I am above right and wrong. I can do anything I please, because after all it's only a game. And this is one of the things that in what I would call imbalanced people is very liable indeed to result from the use of psychedelics, and one of the reasons why society is afraid of it. And this really does present a considerable problem. Of course, we can look to the experience of the past to give us a bit of help in this. Because in Asia, there have, of course, for centuries been people who attained a state of consciousness involving the point of view, A, that the world is a game, and that it is fundamentally harmonious, and that good and evil are ultimately reconciled. Zhuangzi says in his book, those who would have good government without its opposite misrule do not understand the great principles of the universe. One might as well talk about having the positive principle without the negative principle. and such people are therefore either knaves or fools. Pretty bold statement. But nevertheless, the great Taoist sages and the Buddhist masters have always known very well indeed how to handle themselves in terms of a relationship to ordinary society, and have known how to take their holiness lightly, and if one has to have a halo, how to wear it over one ear. If you consult, for example, the literature of Zen, and if you know anything about the way Zen is carried on, here you find an astounding ability of the great men to carry their exalted spiritual state in a very human way. One of the great points of Zen is that its ideal is not to become a superman, only a man, a human. And so the Zen people do not aspire to any claim of superhumanity. And the last thing that they learn in their very long training, say of a person who is going to teach Zen, is, you might think it would be the first thing, but it is the last thing. The last thing is they learn is the Zen interpretation of moral precepts. It comes right at the end. If you read this new book by Miura and Sasaki called the Zen Koan, which is just published, there is, by Miura discusses all the stages of koan study, and right at the end comes the study of the precepts. The irritating thing about this book is that it doesn't tell you anything. It tells you a lot of headings, but no content. And one sometimes wishes that they would either put up or shut up. But it does have in it some marvelous translations of Zen poems, which are well worth the price of the book. But anyway, this point does come out, that it is all part of making a bridge between deep insight and the everyday life of the world. Just as I said, you can't go off into ecstasy, or at least you can, but it isn't a good idea to go off into ecstasy and not ground it. So in just the same way, it is not a good idea to go off into a state of godly omnipotence and divine holiness, etc., and not bring it down to earth. And this is one of the things that I could really complain about among many people who have taken a great deal of psychedelic substances. There is this tendency to poo-poo everything. For example, and to do absolutely outrageous things. There is a movement afoot called the Neo-American Church to put the whole thing on a religious basis. But what do you suppose they do? They have a number of what you might call elders of this church, but they call each one a boohoo. B-O-O-H-O-O, a boohoo. Well, I mean, some people are just going out of their way to make themselves ridiculous. This is the revolution, you see. And for some people are fired with a real revolutionary spirit, that we are going to make this thing work, we are going to turn the world on, and but we're going to do it on our terms. Of course, you can see from the standpoint of deep insight that it's a very cute idea to call a religious patriarch a boohoo. I don't know what boohoo always means in American slang. In my slang, it means a crybaby. Or it means something, it could mean a sort of a hot air bag and real insight that when you arrive at the point of understanding what, for want of a better term, I must call the total harmony of the world, you have to see that in this scheme of things there really is no person who is superior or inferior in the final sense of this word. That is to say, it becomes apparent that everybody at his level and in his place is manifesting the divine just as much as you are, or as much as any Buddha is. This is why it's said in the Buddhist scriptures that when you become a Buddha, everybody else does. And so you have no basis for giving yourself airs and graces, or for breaking other people's game rules in such a way as to cause hostility, because they, in their way, playing their games, even if they're limited games, even if they're bad games, they too are all one with you. And their not knowing that they're enlightened is, at the point where they are, very important indeed. It seems sometimes that events could be put on different levels, and the levels could be numbered. And a level that occurred on number 23, where it was quite right, would seem very wrong if it occurred at level 95. But what happens to us often is that we see an event and think it's at level 95 when it's really only at 23. And so it seems out of place and it seems quite wrong. So this sensation, this real thorough absorption of the point that from the situation of the deepest mystical union, from that standpoint, at that standpoint, all men are equal. All beings are equal. The problem arises when you try to bring that standpoint into practical affairs. You can make one of two mistakes. One by saying, you are all equal, but I am more equal than the rest of you. Because I know you're all equal and you don't. The other is, the more common one, all men are equally inferior. This, of course, is the one from which our culture suffers to a high degree. This is what results in what you might call a sort of travesty of democracy. You see, all democratic thinking in the Western tradition was based on German mysticism. The great tide of democracy came from people inspired by Tauler and Eckhart and Suso and Ruysbroek, the Brothers of the Free Spirit, the Anabaptists, the Levelers. All those people were the seedbed of democratic ideas and the idea of liberty. Their mysticism influenced George Fox and the Quakers. But when you translate this, all men are equal in the sight of God, to all men are equal on the level of politics and economics, then the parody is they're all equally inferior. And this is why it issued in the various fashions in the West for explaining greatness away as neurosis, psychoanalyzing all great saints and artists and so on, and reducing their accomplishments to frustrations in sex and toiletry. This gave everybody, you see, who was then really some kind of a bum, a sense of satisfaction in knowing that the great are, after all, just as inferior as you are. And that is democracy at its worst. What has to be understood, I think, is this. In order to integrate the level of mystical understanding with practical life, you have to remember one of the famous stories of Sri Ramakrishna. There was a student who had been with him and had been learning that all things in the world are Brahman, are the supreme, are manifestations of the divine. And having heard this, he left the master's ashram and went walking down the road, and there comes along an elephant, swinging its trunk and looking rather fierce. And there is a mahout riding on the elephant, and he says to this man, "Hey, get out of the way, this is a fierce elephant." But he thought, I am Brahman, elephant is Brahman, we are all one Godhead, and no trouble can come. So he didn't get out, and as he approached, the elephant swatted him with his trunk and threw him into the bramble bushes at the side of the road, from which he eventually extracted himself, bleeding and bruised, and he went back to the master and told what had happened. And the master shook his head and said to him, "But you should have realized that the mahout warning you was also Brahman." Well, so it is like this. When you see that all people whatsoever, whether they be high or whether they be low, are manifesting the divine just as much as you are, supposing you are in a high situation, you've really seen the mystery, and you see that all people manifest it, you must stop to consider that what also manifests it is the differences between them. That they are arranged in a certain hierarchy. That the king being king and the cobbler being cobbler, they are, but you see, these are like these levels I was just talking about, level 23 and 95. The cobbler at level 23 is doing all right. But what he's doing would not be appropriate at level 95, or however you want to number it or turn it around. So when we equalize things, we must also take into account everything that is there to be equalized. Put it in another way. You might say, if I really understand that all is the work of the divine, should I or should I not be angry when somebody like Hitler destroys millions of Jewish people? Many people jump swiftly to the conclusion that, of course, I ought not to be angry, and then jump to the next conclusion, which is that although I ought not to be angry, if I'm not, I'm extremely cold-hearted. But I would point out that my being angry at such a state of affairs would be as natural as water boiling when put over a fire. I would be very angry indeed. But this anger is included in the manifestations of the divine, just as much as the villainy of the people who destroyed the Jews. They're going to be villainous, I'm going to be angry. It follows like the shadow and the substance. And so you might say, then if all is the divine, why do anything to change anything? If we see any sort of social injustice, or what you will, disease, if it's all divine, let's just let it go, But included in the things that are is change, is irritation, is all the workings of the human being. And so the people who work to change things are just doing their stuff at their level. And they have to be included in this thing, in this totality. Goethe once said, we work with nature even when we work against her. So you have to have the most inclusive view possible in order to integrate these 2 points of view. And it's an oversimplification altogether to say, when you've seen that the divine is in all things, you just curl up your legs, relapse into samadhi, and watch the world go by. That's all right for old men. And for people who are physically tired and weak, that's very proper. To sit on one's porch and in a rocking chair would be the American equivalent. That's fine. But obviously when you are young, you must be involved in the world, because what has to be understood is there is no way of not interfering with life. Even when you glance around this room, you make an effect on it. The slightest little breath upsets things. Not very seriously, not very much, but still it does. Our existence, the mere fact of existence, is an interference. There is no way of not interfering, because you are absolutely connected with everything that goes on, and every move that you make has repercussions. So one has to interfere. Therefore, the question, if you have to interfere, the practical question is how? There are several ways of doing it. Which one? Considering the fine points can bring about dangers. Things like the holy man syndrome. Incidentally, I should mention another point about the holy man syndrome. Not so long ago, a young psychiatrist came to see me who had some experience in these matters, but he had a very noticeable chip on his shoulder. And he was all for emphasizing the point that, say, Zen, he had read a lot about it, was a con game. See? He said, you're a con man, I'm a con man, we're all con men. And he was, everything he did and said had a certain aggression about it. As if to want to say, to make a great point of that we're all crooks. Now, when you see that, you smell a rat, you see? It's all very interesting. But there's a rat here. This person is overcompensating. And therefore he hasn't really understood. If you have to go around, in other words, I'm not so sure. But that little edge of somehow having to insist on it is the same state that I was talking about yesterday in the first seminar. When you understand it fully, you go beyond ecstasy and come back to everyday consciousness. Likewise, when you understand fully, you go beyond any special claim to be a holy man or to be a real devil or whatever exalted position happens to appeal to you. And you come back. But now there's some further wrinkle to this. There always is. There are people, as you know, who are aggressively ordinary. And this is a peculiar phenomenon in the United States, where we very much in this country believe in being natural, and so we feel uncomfortable with ceremonies and with dramatic behavior or dramatic clothes or anything like that. We feel that that's too much. It's showing off. It reminds us of the aristocracies of Europe that persecuted our ancestors, I suppose. And so we like things in this country to be folksy. See? And so we many of us wear sort of beat-up clothes, and especially wealthy people, you'll find. Wealthy people on vacation will wear real beat-up clothes, jeans and old T-shirt, and so on, and look as grubby as possible, because that's natural, you see, that's... Now, so also then, when people realize that they're in a very... they've come to a great exalted insight, and they're going to bring it down to earth, and they realize they shouldn't be aggressive about it. They're going to be as natural as possible. But you can spot, just like that their naturalness is phony. It's put on. So I would say, to be natural, really, you don't have to put on any special guise or something for protecting yourself against other people. What you have to do is to do what you like. In the sense that, really, wear what you like, play what role you like, as long as you're comfortable with it, for yourself, and don't care whether it's natural or not. Then it will be natural. Don't try to be natural, because immediately one can detect the spuriousness of it. So now this brings me to the last question. In view of the whole problem of the social adaptation of unitary consciousness of the world as a total harmony, on the one hand, and our ordinary normal consciousness of the world as an intensely competitive system of gravely serious disputes. We're discussing bringing these things together, fertilizing the one point of view with the other. What are we going to do? So far about the practical problem of psychedelics. I pointed out at the beginning that the whole subject falls between two stools, because as a whole, neither the clerical professions nor the medical profession are ready for it. And this is true even of that aspect of the medical profession which is strictly psychiatry. The divorce of psychiatry and religion, and it is generally speaking a divorce, there are exceptions to this, where clergy, for example, in many theological schools are trained in psychiatry, and there are a number, a smattering of psychiatrists who are members of some kind of religious group. But by and large, psychiatry is attempting to be a pure science without any religious commitment at all. And I get the feeling again and again, and I talk to a great many psychiatric groups, and I talk to them endlessly about methods of therapy and this, that, and the other. But I realize, sort of with a funny intuition that they are completely superficial. They don't even know what therapy is, what they're aiming at. And so often, this is not always the case, therapy means success in getting a person to behave like everyone else, and to give him the same sort of tastes that everybody else has, so that he's a safe norm. But even when this is not the case, and many therapists, say, who follow Maslow, Carl Rogers, and are most brilliant men, I still get this feeling that psychiatry is dying on the vine for lack of any metaphysical foundations. Now, I said I was going to say again something about statistics. Such statistics as there are are showing up today shows that psychiatric treatment, by using other methods than the drugs they're using in asylums to quieten people down, psychiatric treatment is extraordinarily ineffective. Samples show approximately that of any control group, 1/3 of the psychiatric patients recover from their symptoms in 3 to 5 years, and 1/3 of patients under the care of a general practitioner receiving no psychiatric treatment also recover in 3 to 5 years. And those who were under the treatment of the psychiatrists came out a good deal poorer financially. I don't want to say this in a way of belittling the seriousness and the skill with which many psychiatrists are trying to study their problems. But they do have an abominably superficial concept of the human organism and of the human mind. One would think that a psychiatrist would be eager above all to explore every possible modification and state of human consciousness. He should be expert. He should know his way around inside all of them. Just as a linguist wants to master many languages, so a psychiatrist should master many madnesses and many mystical states. He should run the whole gamut from mystical vision to catatonic schizophrenia and know them all from the inside. Because then he's in a position to communicate with his patients. He cannot communicate while he remains a mere professor of psychiatry. See? Psychiatry is not something that you can study like the history of Persian pottery. And it's all out there, and it's objective, and so on, and you never have to get involved. To be a therapist effectively, you have to be right on the inside there. You have to get mixed in with it. And even though you may lose a certain objectivity and scientific impartiality by doing this, what you've got to acquire is the art of being able to get involved and then come out again and be scientifically impartial and then get in again. And that's difficult, but it's worth trying. But the reason, you see, the psychiatrist is afraid so often to get involved because he's scared of losing his own sanity. And he knows, that we walk on pretty thin ice so far as our sanity is concerned. And so don't muck around with that. He's seen too many of his colleagues who worked for a long time in asylums who had to be quietly removed to another asylum. Happens all too readily. But it is the fear of insanity, more than anything, which makes one insane. The fear of getting lost in all those strange corridors. Ever had dreams where you're going through mazes, corridors, wondering whether you'll ever get out, whether anybody will ever... Well, crazy people have an awful time with that corridor syndrome, because they are the corridors of the mind. Therefore, there is a certain protection of one's sanity in being able to go into various states. And above all, what I said a moment ago, was that the thing that strikes me about psychiatry so forcibly is its lack of a metaphysical foundation, in which, you see, it is simply imitating the fashionable point of view of scientism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. To push across the point of view that this universe is trivial. It is nothing but, whatever you want to say, nothing but something or other. See? But definitely nothing but. Desperately important to get everything down to nothing but, so that we can say, no mysteries left about it. Doesn't matter. It's so simple. No? And that's a manifestation of hostility, you see, of hatred of life lying under that. Because people were too afraid of letting themselves go, to be able to admit that they could look at this world and say, wow, look at that. Isn't that marvelous? Oh, you're just ignorant, you. You think these things are marvelous, but it just shows you not sophisticated. Because you see, one of the games of aristocracy in Europe was always to look bored. And so there are all sorts of, you could put a whole history together of how people copy the attitudes of their superiors in order to get one up on them.